Good evening. This is a question. This is a difficult topic. That's one of the reasons that I chose to do this. The problem of evil and suffering in the world. Everybody experiences trials and difficulties at some point in their life here, and oftentimes this is really the big question. If when I meet people who say they are atheists, I had a professor at Simon Greenleaf who said there aren't really atheists. An atheist is someone who is really very hurt and very angry at God for not existing. It's really an emotional issue for a lot of people. So we're gonna cover this issue, and there's really two parts to the issue. The first part is, and by the way, the answer is more complicated than the question. The question is basically, if there's a God and he's all good, then he would want to eliminate evil and suffering from the world. And if he was all powerful, he could. So the fact that there's evil and suffering in the world means that there's something illogical about this. Either God is not all powerful or he's not all good, or there isn't a God. So the question is reasonably simple, but the answer is a little more complicated. The first part of it is really, is it logical? Can there be such a God? Is it possible? Or is it really an impossibility? And the second question, so it's a factual question, it's a logical question, is Christianity, for example, irrational? And the second part of the question, which is really a more potent part of the question, this is a personal and emotional question, and often that's the deeper question. As a psychologist, I find that a lot of people, once you answer their factual objections about something, they still have difficulty making a decision because there's a powerful emotional side to things. And that's really a very important part of this question, so we're going to be spending some time on that as well. Now, whenever you're talking about something or asking a question, you have to define the terms. In science, we would always have like an operational variable. You'd have to define, what are you talking about? What does this mean? What is actually the definition of the thing you're trying to examine or test? So, what is good? The other question is, what is bad? We've asked the question, why do bad things happen to good people? The implication in the question is that the person is good and the things that happen to them are bad. So this brings up, when I studied at the University of Strasbourg in the Human Rights Program, this is a summer program there, and people came from all over the world. I had right next to me in the dormitory a lawyer from Iran at the time, and across the hall, a human rights worker from Colombia. They had a lot of problems in Colombia at the time because of the drug wars and things. So there were people from third world countries, from major countries, from all over the world, and different scenarios of what was happening in the countries. And the definition of what is human rights, the European Union comes to a definition, and there's actually a court in the Americas that has a definition of what the human rights are. But there's a big debate about what are the human rights and where do they come from. And that's a big question. What's right and what's wrong? Not everybody agrees. And this came up in Eichmann's trial. Eichmann was the mastermind of the Holocaust of 6 million Jews in Germany. He was put in charge of that. He didn't actually kill any Jews, but he was in charge of the whole thing. And he escaped at the end of World War II. And in the 1960s, the Jewish Mossad tracked him down. I believe it was in Ecuador. Don't quote me on that, but tracked him down and brought him back to Israel for trial. And at his trial is very interesting because the court was trying to try him of crimes that actually were not crimes according to the country he was in when he committed them. He was doing what was lawful and legal. What Hitler said, what the Fuhrer said, had the effect of law. And the Fuhrer wanted this to happen, Hitler wanted this to happen, and he was carrying out the orders. So his argument was, I was just doing what was legal in the country and what we considered as a society, what we were supposed to do and what was right. You're just trying me because you won the war. So this is just the victor grinding down on the loser. If we'd won the war, the tables would be turned and we would be trying you. And the judge, what do you think the judge said? Anybody? What do you think the judge said? Thanks for playing. No, he said, yes, there are laws in a society. There are right and wrong. Cultural people consider what's right and wrong, but there is a law that is above the law. There's a law beyond the nations, beyond the time frame of the immediate situation, beyond the culture. And, of course, he didn't really have any powerful justification for where those laws came from, but he said, no, I can't accept this argument. So what basis do you have for making a judgment about what's good and bad? What is your basis? So when you ask the question, or when somebody asks that question, what do they mean and where does that come from? And what's their basis? Because not everybody agrees. So here's Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, at the height of his power as a Nazi SS lieutenant colonel in charge of Hitler's Jewish bureau. And this is John Warwick Montgomery, who was the dean of the law school I went to. He wrote a little book. You can still get it on the internet, on Amazon, called The Law Above the Law. If there is nothing beyond human opinion, then we do not have anything beyond the laws of the society. So where does law come from? This is a quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a big influence on the founding of this country. Thomas Jefferson quoted him a lot. His philosophy was very influential. He's not a fundamentalist Christian by any means. But he says, quote, in order to discover the rules of society best suited to nations, a superior intelligence, beholding all the passions of men, without experiencing any of them, would be needed. This intelligence would have to be wholly unrelated to our nature, while knowing it through and through. Its happiness would have to be independent of us, and yet ready to occupy itself with ours. And lastly, it would have, in the march of time, to look forward to a distant glory, and working in one century, be able to enjoy in the next. Not just the superficial present circumstances, but it would have to have a larger picture. It would take gods to give men laws. By the way, Plato also came to the same conclusion 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, that he would need a revelation from God to really have some foundation for law. So Chuck Colson, which I showed in my last little video, if those of you who was here last time, by the way? Great. A bunch of you were. Charles Colson, in It's a Natural, a Dangerous Grace, he writes this: there are only two alternatives. Either we are created, and the law is the law because its reference point is the Creator, or this is a godless universe, and the law is merely what humans from time to time decide that it is, because there is nothing else for it to be. There's no other alternative. So the question of what is good and what is bad. The questions are today, is abortion right or is it wrong? Is it a right to choose, or is it a homicide of an unborn baby? Is sodomy a right, or is it an evil? Is polygamy healthy, or is it destructive? Not all cultures agree on these things at the same thing. By the way, the first one, abortion, the United States was the only country, when I was going to the International School of Human Rights, the United States was one of the only countries in the Western Hemisphere not to ratify the Treaty on Human Rights in this hemisphere. And the reason was because the United States would not agree that the protection of life extends to the unborn, which the other countries would ratify. So we're not necessarily in agreement, all the countries. A cannibal's rule. If you have a rule in our country, look, you don't eat other people, but in a cannibalistic society, it might be don't clean your plate. This is an interesting thing that happened when I toured. I went to East Germany in 1981. Went behind the Iron Curtain, and I toured a bunch of sites there. One of them, it's now you can go there easily now because it's a free country. It's part of Germany, overall Germany. But one thing that we did we went to the concentration camp at Auschwitz. And at Auschwitz, I learned a few things that were pretty striking. The guards, who were Germans, they were just recruited into the German army. They were sent on assignment here, and they were told, they were ordered, they had to shoot people coming off the trains. And there's a description of what would happen, and they would be horrified at this, and they would not want to do it, but they're ordered to do it, and they have to do it, and they would suffer severe consequences if they didn't. So they did. They shot them. And then the next trainload that came, they were ordered. They had an aversion to it, but they shot them. The third one, then they had less aversion, and by the fourth or fifth time, they had no aversion to shooting these helpless prisoners. And by 6 or 7, actually, they were beginning to enjoy the power, and they were beginning to relish it. And these are normal. I mean, it's not that the Germans are different than the Americans or something. These are just average Joes. So if you make decisions, you actually change what you think is good and bad. We can quench our conscience, and we can change our conscience. There's another experiment that I'll talk about a little later about how we can, just the common man, what we're really capable of. Anyway, so the implicit assumption, just asking a question, by the way, reveals an awareness of good and evil, that there is a belief, there is such a thing as a good that's beyond personal opinion and an evil. Disease, if you have disease, then you have an intended design. You have health. Any doctor will tell you, this is healthy, this is unhealthy. Well, what does that mean? It's supposed to operate a certain way. There's a design in the way it's supposed to operate. If you have disorder, then there's order. So in psychology, we have disorders, psychological disorders. The implication, everybody is assuming that there's some way that we're supposed to work psychologically. There's an order. If you have ugliness, then beauty also exists. If you have evil, then somewhere there's holiness. And if there's such a thing as being mean, then you're admitting that there are such a thing as acts of kindness. So how do people explain evil? One way is Rabbi Kushner, Jewish writer, very popular maybe 2 decades ago. He wrote a book, and he said, in which he postulated that God is all loving. He is loving. And yet there's evil in the world. So therefore, God is not really all-powerful. So he can't really stop it. He can't stop it. He's not all-powerful to do it. So that was the postulate of the book. Another way people explain it is it's really an illusion. Christian Science, we have a Christian Science reading room down here, but they believe that evil is really an illusion. It's just a perception that you have. It's an illusion. It's not really a real thing. My professor at the law school used to say about the Christian Scientists, and the doctor then stuck him with a hat pin, and he said, "Ouch! I guess the pain, the illusion of pain is as bad as the pain would actually be." Anyway, Buddhism says we all suffer because of desire. The root of suffering is desire. And so the Buddha, we don't really know anything really historically clearly about the Buddha, except stories that developed about him. Contrary to, if you were here last time, about the solid historical evidence for Jesus and what he did in his resurrection, the Buddha, we really don't have any good historical documents. You can even look it up on Wikipedia about the Buddha, and you'll see they'll say, well, we really don't have good historical information about him. But Buddhism, the Buddha supposedly did say he was a prince, and he somehow got out of the palace, and he was in the streets with the suffering of the common people, and it shocked him, and he tried to figure out, what is going on and what is the solution to this. He decided that we suffer because of our desires, and as we desire things and we don't have them, and we suffer because of that. So the solution in Buddhism is to get rid of all desire and eventually merge one with the universe, and then you won't suffer. Two sides of the same thing. That's another way to explain evil and suffering. You remember the Force in Star Wars? There's the bad side of the Force or the good side of the Force, but it's the same thing. It could go either way, and they're both equal. Hindu, Confucianism's yin and yang is like male and female. So there's the yin-yang symbol. there's the evil and the good, and inside the good is some evil, and inside the bad is some good, but they're just equal and opposite, and they both coexist. Freud's hypothesis in psychology was the founder of pretty much psychoanalytic psychology and a lot of things in psychology. His idea was that there's a libido. Most people think that's sexual, but really what that means is it's a life force. Libido means life, so it was a drive that everybody has innately to want to connect and have relationship and love and attachment. But that didn't, when World War II broke out and there was such mass inhumanity to man and destruction, that confused Freud, and he was scratching his head. I don't understand. So he came up with this other drive called thanatos, which is the Greek word for death. So he figured, well, I guess we also have a death drive. We have a drive to life and a drive to death, and that explains everything. Another way of explaining it is that there's no such thing. It's just a cycle of life, you know. You live, you die. It's not really evil or good. It's just a cycle of life. One professor argued with Montgomery when he was debating the dean of the law school. He said, you know, death is just like pattern baldness. It's just something that happens, and it's just a part of life. So that's, you could see that in The Lion King. There's a circle of life, and life comes around, and it comes around again. So man is good, or he's corrupted by the environment. Man's basically good. That's another way people sometimes explain it. It's corrupted by the environment. Skinner, behaviorism, this is the learning theory that if you have certainly rewards or punishments, you learn from rewards and punishments. So you have a blank slate. A child comes out, he's just blank slate, and whatever you do influencing the child, whatever learning experiences that the child has, that's how the child turns out. So it's not innately good or evil or choices. It's basically all about the environment. Locke also, who influenced a lot of founders of the country, believe this. And communism's assumption. This is what happens in communism. Karl Marx, Lenin, they believed that the problem in the world is that there is a system that's capitalistic, and so people collect more money, and then they begin to own the means of production, and they grind down on the other people, and so the proletariat, the people who are workers, are ground down on, and it's because of the system. So if we get rid of the system, and then everybody will become good, and everybody will become wonderful. It's caused by the system. So they convince people, sounds like a good idea, holding things in common. The whole community owns everything. Nobody has an advantage. The philosophy was from each according to his ability, and to each according to his need. Sounds good, right? However, the problem is they assumed that people were basically good, so the people in power who were going to accomplish this and confiscate all the property and hold it in common, they actually didn't release. They still haven't released the property. If you can look at Vladimir Putin, he has a lot of money, and he's not really being very nice to his people, right? So there was a problem with that philosophy. The devil made me do it. It's half a joke, but it's a way of saying it. The responsibility is not on me, it's outside me. Genetic, it's evolutionary. There's a gene, and the selfish gene, it somehow had survival value. Finally, it comes from ignorance, so we have to educate people. But are you saying that the highly educated upper class is good? The people who are at the heads of the companies then are good? The people who are in Congress, and they're all really good, really good people? Just because they're educated? There's a lot of educated people who do pretty bad things. So none of this really fits. None of these really explain it. None offer a real solution, and most simply deny it as real, evil as real. It's some product of something else. All deny personal responsibility, except Kushner sort of blames God because he is too weak to do anything about it. But so what's the Bible's explanation? The Bible's explanation, Romans 1:20, says that everyone knows that God is. and everyone knows some things about God. And no one really has an excuse, and what we actually do is we internally suppress it. In Mark 10:18, Luke 18:19, Jesus asks the question, who is good? Let's look at Mark 10. Jesus started on his way. A man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. Good teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? This is Jesus' response. Why do you call me good? Jesus answered, no one is good except God alone. And he goes on and he talks to the person, you know the commandments. Jesus is questioning me, oh, you say good teacher. What are you really saying? This man actually thought he was good, but when Jesus got to his underlying motives and what he was devoted to, his motives weren't really pure. And he was saying, by the way, if you're calling me good, who's good? Only God's good. Can you trust the heart of man? Do you think so? Can you trust the heart of a man? Can I trust my own heart? Can I even trust my own heart? Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? As a matter of fact, the famous psychiatrist Paul Minirth, and Frank likes to quote him, this is his favorite verse he has in his office. The heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? We are masters of deception. So, and the other part of this is really in Genesis, the story of Genesis is Adam and Eve are created, and Adam and Eve decide that they want to disobey God's command. They want to eat of this fruit in the garden, and they want to know good and evil. The devil tempts them and says, and according to the Bible, that you can know, God knows that you're going to know good and evil like he does when you do this, as if God's keeping something good from you. And they eat, and all of a sudden everything changes. The whole world changes. Well, why does that seem like a big deal? Isn't knowledge a good thing? In a way, we were never intended to know evil. And even more significantly, really, we were never intended to be judges. We were never intended to be in a position where we're going to pass judgment on what's good and what's bad. I want to be the judge. And so people ever since really have wanted to be the judge. And the first thing that happened to Adam and Eve, by the way, is they became self-conscious and they hid. So they're judging themselves. Judgments all of a sudden start to happen all over the place. But man always wants to be the judge, even of God. So God, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. I don't think we want to be the judge, even of God. So evil, by the way, evil, what is evil? Evil's not stuff. It's not like a bucket of stuff. I got a bucket of sand here. What evil is evil is a consequence of, it's not something that's created. God said, poof, I made evil. What it is it's a misuse of free will. God gives us free will. We can use it however we want. But that's not the same thing as a bucket of stuff or something that is created. It's a misuse of something that's created. So God of the Bible gave mankind freedom. A good thing, right? But evil is messy. See, people think, well, why did this person suffer? They didn't do anything to deserve this particular thing, and that happened to that person. God made the universe ordered, but once evil comes into it, it's a crazy mess. So it's like throwing a monkey wrench into the gears. You've got a nice running machine. It's designed to do something. Somebody just throws a wrench in it, it crashes. And, well, the engine is not working. Well, now the rest of the car isn't working. Everything's not working because somebody threw a wrench into the engine because it's all interconnected. So evil's messy. A terrorist plants a bomb at the Boston Marathon. Is it discriminate about who gets hurt? Anybody within shot of the bomb gets hurt. It's not one-to-one correspondence. It's a mess. So one person's evil affects many. And this is because God made us interconnected. God said, according to the Bible, his most high value is relationship. So he made us for the possibility of being connected, and he connected us to one another. He didn't put us in you're isolated over here. So somebody puts a pollutant out of their plant because they're greedy, and the people down the river get affected. And one person, gets married, they have kids, and then they beat their child, and because they're in a relationship, and they have that capacity. You have the capacity for good and bad, and because we're interconnected, we affect others. There isn't really like a victimless crime, because in some way, what we do does affect other people around us, and so we affect each other and our world. We also affect God. That's what the Bible says. So, and that's what we're talking about right now. This is not about I'm not giving you a defense for what's true or what's not. I'm just telling you what it does make sense. It's a logical explanation. You don't know if it's you don't know if it's true or not just by this, but it could be true. It's a logical explanation. It makes sense. By asking the question, everyone knows there's a good design. I already went over that. And they know that we're not in paradise anymore. So, in case anybody wondered, this is not paradise. You probably all know that already. So love is impossible without the real possibility of rejection. If God made puppets, that would be one thing, but he didn't. If you give somebody a choice, you're giving them the right to reject you. Nobody comes up and says, no man comes up to a woman and says, you must go out with me right now, and it's going to work. Or that's a relationship. That's not a relationship. That's coercion. That's a master slave. I'm making you do this. Nobody, would you like God if he did that with us? But he doesn't do that. He gives us a choice and a free will. And so God is not a manipulator. He's not a cosmic manipulator. The God of the Bible is not a cosmic manipulator. He is a God that gives us an explanation. This is the cause of the problems in the world. So Christianity provides a solution too. And I'm going to go into that later. It doesn't just explain the problem, it explains the solution. Jesus satisfied both the justice of God for the evil and the pain and the suffering in the world, and he also satisfied the mercy. So they're both satisfied in that one act on the cross. And here's a good summary of what we've just been doing.
Is God good? If he is, why is there suffering and evil? Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies and subatomic particles and rainforests and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle or a one-ended stick. So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing. But if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God. Because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom. The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom. But let's remember, we don't suffer alone. God will put an end to suffering and evil. And God became a man to suffer with us. God is good, And He wants real people, like you, to know Him. But the free choice is yours.
So, interesting enough, in the field of psychology, how many people do you think, now most of us think that we're pretty good. We do there's a survey that some of the people in my church go, and they go to hand out sodas, and they ask people to check off on the survey, and most people check off, oh yeah, this and that, and they think that they're pretty, well, you're pretty good. Yeah, I'm a pretty good person. Most people think they're actually a good person. What percent, there's this whole phenomena of illusory superiority in psychology. So what percent of people rate themselves as above average? Now, average would be 50%, right? So if they were accurate, it'd be 50%. So what percentage do you think? 85 or 93% rate themselves as better drivers than others. And I think the other 7% probably didn't understand the question. 85% say they get along better with others than most people. So 85% think they get a better. Well, ask the other person they're getting along with and see what they say. Actually, this is amazing to me. 25% put themselves in the top 1% of relating to others. So 25% are in the top 1%. And so really the problem is we see evil as being outside of us. The evil in the world. God should do something about it. That bad evil, all that evil out there, those bad people that do those bad things. God should do something about it. I'm going to give you an example from marital therapy. People come to me for marital therapy, and it's very common that their initial desire, the man will say, might not say it directly, but implying, fix her. And the woman will say, she might not say it directly, but all these problems, and she's listing the problems that he's causing her. So fix her, fix him, fix her, fix him. And are we going to get anywhere? Nobody's going to get anywhere until somebody takes personal responsibility. And really, both of us take personal responsibility, because neither one of us, God says, neither one of us is really good. And there's a test we used to do. We don't do it anymore as much, but it's called the Taylor-Johnson. And what I liked about it, I didn't like a lot of things about the test, but what I did like about it is that it would have the answers that people gave on themselves, rating themselves, here's what I'm like, and it would have scales that would say dominant or submissive, aggressive or docile, angry or peaceful, et cetera, all kinds of things that answer all these questions about themselves. But the interesting thing is you'd have the couples answer the question about themselves, but the test had a way you also answered the questions about your spouse. So you would have, for each spouse, you would have how they saw themselves, and then you'd have how their spouse saw them. They didn't match a lot of the times. So who's right? If you want to find out how good I am, you got to ask my wife. Don't ask her, though. Freud says we suppress the truth about ourselves. We have repression, we have suppression. We really don't want to know what's true about ourselves. And in fact, things start coming up, and we get anxiety, and we have dreams, and we push them back down. We have all these defense mechanisms. Everybody's heard of defense mechanisms now since Freud. There's a whole list of them, maybe 10 of them or 10 or 12 of them. And these are not things that even Freud saw. The things he was defining as defense mechanisms were not even conscious. They're not things that we're saying, I'm going to express this. No, there are things that even we've done them so well, they're just automatic. We don't even know we're doing them. And Jesus said in the Beatitudes, you have heard it say, for example, but I say, if you've lusted in your heart, you've already committed adultery in your heart. If you're angry or unforgiving, you've already murdered in your heart. If you've coveted or envied, you've already stolen in your heart. So here's two people. One One's a Pharisee, the other one is a tax collector. You could say one's a senator and the other one is a pimp or something. You know, the equivalent of this day and age, a tax collector would be like the worst person because he collected money from the people to pay to Rome, and he was like betraying them. So Luke 18:9-14 says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus said this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector, he stood at a distance, and he beat his breast. He would not even look up to heaven. And he said, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. He wouldn't even look up. And which one do you think Jesus said was justified? He said, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalted themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So, the Sunday school teacher was never more like the Pharisee than when she said to her class, thank God, children, we're not like that Pharisee. Well, what is somebody saying, or what am I saying when I say, I'm not going to believe because of those hypocrites? Aren't they saying the same thing? Which person are you? So, of course, none of us think we are like the hypocrites. It's only those other people. But do you live up to your own professed values? Let alone God's values or what he's presenting. Do I live up to my own values? This was Jesus' point. You who are against adultery, do you commit adultery, he says. Have you ever cheated emotionally or otherwise on anyone? You who are against lying, have you ever lied? I know I have. You who are against stealing, have you ever stolen? I know I have. I'm not going to say anything publicly, though. If you are, I'm not generally a liar, please, but I'm not lying now. I won't tell the joke. How can you tell when a lawyer is lying? Well, I don't want to, What's that? What's that? Oh, it's when his lips move. Okay. Anyway, you're for having a second chance. Everybody deserves a second chance. You learn from my mistakes. But have you not forgiven someone? Aren't you judging those judgmental, self-righteous people? Isn't that all? Isn't that kind of a... You can't say that without judging yourself. So in Luke 18:19, I was just talking about how Jesus says, no one's good except God. So the problem of evil is not outside ourselves, it's inside us. It's in every one of us. And the world is really, this description of the world is really like, this is after the Second World War. This is Cologne Cathedral. Cologne Cathedral was a beautiful place, unbelievable, stained glass windows, just spectacular, built over hundreds of years by people putting in lots of artistic effort, carefully and painstakingly and lovingly. And it got bombed along with the city. And there were holes in the walls, holes in the windows. But you could go into that cathedral, and you could see the glory of that cathedral. It wasn't decimated. It was a lot of parts were destroyed. You could see holes in the window, but you could see the beauty that was still there. Our world is like that. It's a beautiful world marred by sin. I just pulled up a butterfly. It's got a damage to the wing, but you're looking at that, man, that is amazing. But there's something wrong with it, and it's got damage to its wings. It's not right. And you look at another human being, and you can see, they're a pain. There's all kinds of problems. Their bodies got problems with it. But there's something special about it. And that's true about the world. So if we shake our fist at God, shaking our fist at God, you're not fair. Do we really want cosmic justice? Because if we have cosmic justice, God really, biblically, God has a problem. His problem is that if he judges the world now, we're all guilty and we get wiped away because we're a part of the problem. And if you all, how many saw the movie Noah? A couple of people? Well, it was some people liked it, some people hated it. But you know what was the depiction in the movie is okay. But one thing about the movie was the depiction of the evil in the world. And even Noah has a discussion with his wife and saying, really, we're not good either. We have this problem and that problem. And the problem is everybody gets wiped away. If he waits, we're mad at him for his long suffering and patience with the world because we're impatient for him to fix it. Come on, fix it now. So God has a big problem, doesn't he? Jesus explains why the evil is still in the world, why it doesn't end now, which we want it to end now, especially if we're having difficulties and we're suffering. Revelation 6:9 says, it records the slain servants, they're sitting under the table, they're under the throne, and they've been executed, and they're there under the throne of God, and they're saying, how long, Lord, until you avenge our blood? How long do we have to wait? And what do you think Jesus' response is? He says, you have to wait a little longer. There's still more saints to come into the kingdom. There's still more things to happen. He's not done. So he tells in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, Matthew 13:24-30, Jesus says to pull up the weeds, which is the evil, would destroy all the good. So let's just have a look at that for a second. Matthew 13:24-30. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? It's like our question. Why is there evil? Didn't you do a good job creating? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, do you want us to go and pull them up? Pull up the weeds? No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. So Jesus explains it a little later, explaining to his disciples, explain the parables in verse 36. Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. He answered, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. And the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out his kingdom, out of his kingdom, everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So Jesus is saying, I will solve the problem, but I'm not going to solve it now because I'm going to disturb the good that's going on. So our suffering, there's a reason for it. There's only two possibilities, really. Our suffering is either meaningless, which if you believe that there is no God, then it is just things happen. I saw a bumper sticker. I won't use the words, a four-letter word that begins with an S, happens. You know, that's the philosophy. Just happens. Stuff happens. And so it's either meaningless. Henry Ford said history is just one word with a D, four-letter word, thing after another. And is that true? Or is there meaning? Is it meaningful? Is there a point to anything? And if it's meaningful, then that makes all the difference. And Christ and the biblical approach is that he makes suffering meaningful. How does he make it meaningful? It's only temporary. Matthew 12:24-40, 2 Corinthians 4:17, many more. We have this temporary and light affliction, but we will have an eternal glory. So there's these verses about it's only temporary. This is so short compared to eternity. The time that we will suffer is so short. So it makes it meaningful. It gives us fellowship with Christ. Philippians 3:10 and others. I'll just read this briefly. Unless Frank can just quote it. Philippians 3:10 says, I want to know Christ, yes, the power of the resurrection, and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so in some way and somehow attaining the resurrection from the dead. So there's many ways that the Bible talks about we have fellowship with him because he suffered and we're suffering. We have a fellowship with him. There's no relationship that's so close. I don't know anybody who's been in combat. Anybody in here been in combat? If you come across somebody who's been in serious combat with their platoon and went through horrendous things, they will often have a friendship and a bond that will last their entire life. And that's what he's talking about. Christ makes suffering meaningful because it produces character. Romans 5, James 1. It says, actually, the Bible implies that the only way to really produce character is by suffering. Well, I won't go into that. We can read those verses later because I'm just seeing the time. But he suffered himself and he helps us. He's there to help us. The disciples rejoice because they suffered for the name. In Acts 5:41, they did nothing wrong but tell people great news about a man risen from the dead and that they can have life. And what happened? They got beat and they got told, you don't tell this. If you ever saw The Passion of the Christ with the whips and the scourging, that's the kind of thing that happened. Probably not quite as severe as that one. I think he went a little bit over the top in the movie maybe, but they got whipped really horribly. A terrible thing to do to somebody who's just telling you good news. And what did they do? They went back and they rejoiced because they got to suffer for a cause, for a good reason. They were counted worthy because they're just trying to do good and they're suffering for it. There's some reward in that and they will be rewarded. That gives meaning to suffering. My kingdom is not of this world. So Pilate has Jesus in front of him, and Pilate asks Jesus, are you a king? And Jesus responds to him. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would fight. So Jesus was like a lamb. He didn't stop it. He could have stopped everything, but he didn't. He even told Peter, put the sword down. Why? Because he says, this is not my kingdom. This world's not what I'm living for. So if you have meaning, if you're living for more than this world, you have a reason and you have meaning, and you can make it through because you know there's a reason and there's some world coming, and everything is going to make sense. This is what Jesus is saying. Christ makes suffering because there's no comparison with the joy to come. Paul says the present sufferings are not even worthy to be compared to the glory that is going to come. And he suffered some pretty horrible things. So for him to say that's pretty spectacular. Delayed gratification. Jesus endured. See, Jesus himself endures the cross and the horrible things that he went through for the future glory. We can see this on a small case. I got too many degrees already. But, to get a degree, you have to go to school and study and do all this stuff. And there's a lot of work involved, and it's like, you're kind of poor, and you got to pay for the school, and you're not making any money and all this kind of stuff. So why do you do it? Because you see something better in the future, and that's what if you know there is something better waiting, you can do it. Inwardly, we're being renewed. 2 Corinthians 16:18 says, the flesh is decaying, is dying, but the spirit is being renewed. So the outside may be deteriorating, but the inside is being made new and regenerated and renewed and being prepared for something much greater to come. So our bodies are not, they matter, but they're not the main theme. I'm blessed in my longing. So Psalm 42:1 says, as a deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after you. And Matthew 5:4-6 is also talking about how Paul is just waiting and yearning and longing. And Jesus talks about that, longing for heaven. So if you're a secular psychologist and somebody comes into your office and says, I have cancer, I'm going to die in 6 months, what do you say to them? Anybody have an idea? What does a secular psychologist do? What does he say? Tell him to do everything. Do your bucket list. Do everything you want to do, right? Because tomorrow you're going to die. What if he can't because he's suffering and hurting and he can't do everything? What do you tell him? Stuff happens. Yeah, that'll be really helpful. I don't want to go to that psychologist, but really, you don't have anything to say. Somebody walked into, we have a little storage business, and somebody walked in, and he found out I was a psychologist and I was a Christian. He said, well, how do those go together, and how do you do that? And I asked him, I said, what would you say to somebody who comes in and says, I have cancer and I'm dying in 6 months? What hope do you give them? What do you say to them? And he said, good point. You have nothing to say to them. But do you say, let's make you as comfortable as possible? Let's give you some drugs, make you comfortable. Irvin Yalom, existential psychiatrist and group therapy guru. He wrote the book on group therapy. He's actually, I've heard him at a conference, and he's describing how it's so important to have meaning, and people need meaning. We long for meaning. We've got to have something meaningful in our lives. But he actually doesn't really believe that there is an ultimate meaning, so we have to make our own meaning, which is what an atheistic existentialist believes. We have to make our own meaning, and then we have to kind of pretend that we didn't make it. This gets into a little discussion of what exactly is stress, what's good stress, what's bad stress. One of my mentors, Dr. A.E. Wilder Smith, was an expert in stress, and he described how we're built for stress. Our bodies are built for stress. Our muscles are built for stress. If we don't exercise even for a week, if you're in a hospital bed and you're laying there, you don't even turned over, your muscles will atrophy. You'll have problems, and the bones actually will atrophy. That's a concern that they have when they sent astronauts into space to the space station. They didn't have stress on the bones. They have to be putting force on them and doing exercise, or the bones will actually deteriorate. So our bodies are built to be in stress. And our minds also are built for stress. We have to have challenges and things to solve. If we have nothing to do, we're in bad shape. The difference between healthy stress and bad stress, what do you think it is? Anybody? Doing it alone? That's one good answer. Anybody have another answer? How we deal with it. What we do with it. Okay, anybody else? So what makes good stress versus bad stress? Produces a good end result. I'm going to tell you what he found really is the definition of good stress versus bad stress. So if you have a problem and you can't solve it, and you know you can't solve the problem, and everything you do is futile, is that going to be toxic stress to you, or is it going to be good for you? It's going to be toxic. If you have meaning or purpose, It's good stress. If I would have a physics problem. When I was Case Western Reserve University, first I was a physics major before I became a polymer science major, and they would give us problems, I mean, unbelievable relativity problems. I would spend like 10 hours on one problem, one math problem. Some of you did math problems in high school, anybody? And can you imagine, just so complicated, you have to spend 10 hours on it. Man, what's the answer to this thing? But you know what? It didn't really hurt me, because I knew there was ultimately an answer, and I was working. I'm going to solve it. You ever see somebody working at something? It's a project. You know, maybe they're building something, or they're doing something. I'm putting together the presentation. I got to work for hours and hours and hours. Well, it's really not bad stress. And actually, a guy, Chikaranga Singha, I can't pronounce his name, but wrote this book called Flow, how people get in a flow state. You know, they're really into it, and they're in the zone. They're working on something. But it's only because there's a meaning or a purpose, and they see there's a solution. So our minds are meant for meaning. If it's futile, it's toxic. So Viktor Frankl, famous psychiatrist, but he was a Jewish psychiatrist, and he was in a concentration camp. I think it was in Buchenwald, but he records how they gave the prisoners this task where they would dig a hole, and then the prisoners the next day they would fill in the hole, and then the next day they would dig the hole again, and then the next day they would fill it in, on and on. And it was incredibly destructive and demoralizing, because they knew this is pointless. We are just going to fill this hole in tomorrow. We're going to do nothing. I think some state workers maybe feel this way. But okay, you can edit that out of the tape. But I mean, you're thinking, I'm doing this and there's no point to it. That's toxic stress. And he found a way to make it meaningful. That's how he actually made it out. Because actually, prisoners would actually die because of the just hopelessness of the situation and the pointlessness of it. So if we know there's a meaning, it's so powerful. By the way, if you think the God of the universe doesn't care, you have to look at what Jesus did. Do you know that the Holy Spirit compelled Jesus to suffer? In fact, immediately after he gets baptized by John the Baptist, and the Holy Spirit comes on him in John, what's the first thing the Holy Spirit does? He compels him to go into the wilderness to do what? To be tempted, attacked by Satan for 40 days. That's pretty serious. That's worse than having Hitler in front of you. You're having the evil mastermind of the universe trying to influence you for 40 days with no one else around. That's pretty serious. Why? So even Jesus had to learn. The Bible says he had to learn. Here's the God of the universe that the Bible says came into history, came as a baby into the world. He created everything, and now he has to learn. How can God learn anything? But Hebrews 5:8 says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Somehow he learned obedience. Now, it wasn't that he disobeyed his parents and did things, but somehow he had to grow, he had to mature, he had to learn by going through things. He had to learn by going through things that suffer. Do you think we're any different? If the one who made us, the master of the universe, is our example, do you think we're going to learn anything without any trials and difficulties and obstacles? Am I going to learn physics without, some effort? So the question to Frankl, I saw him, Viktor Frankl, at a conference, and I asked him at the end of his speech, I said, I was really interested in the question. I didn't know the answer. I really was wrestling with this in psychology and studying it and thinking about it. What do you think, what really is the key ingredient for people to change? There's a lot of people that come in for therapy that don't really change. What's really the key ingredient? You know what he said? What do you think he said? That's right, he said suffering. It was shocking. It was just one word. That was it. End of the answer. He just said suffering. So if you're interested in him, you can get his book. One of his books is Man's Search for Meaning. So changing the name of people in therapy from client to patient, there's a big push. We're going to call them clients, the client this, instead of the patient. But I agree with one of my professors that really the root of patient is pathos. From which we get like the passion of the Christ. It's passion. It's struggling. It's suffering with something, going through something. So I like that name actually, patient, because everyone who comes to my office really, and they engage in the process, they're heroic in a sense. They're really wrestling and suffering and struggling with something, and they're going to grow when they do. By the way, do you even trust a politician or a leader who hasn't suffered? Does anybody vote for somebody who says, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and everything went my way, please vote for me? Anybody vote for that person? That's all we have to vote for. Okay. No, I think that many of them have suffered. Maybe they have different ideas, but the prayer, make me like Jesus and make me holy, that Paul was praying and the disciples were praying, or grant me the fruits of the Holy Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control. How do you get patience? How do you get joy? How do you get peace? How do you get self-control? If you never allow your kids to experience any difficulties, we can't let them, they're going to get hurt, oh no, their feelings might get hurt. What's going to happen? They aren't going to develop any self-control. They'll develop no patience. None of this will happen. So how do you think these things are built? So there's some lessons from positive psychology. Actually I'm going a little longer than I thought, but the lessons from positive psychology, there's a whole field of psychology. It's all about pathology and how things go wrong, and that's how all the history of psychology pretty much had been until like maybe 15, 20 years ago. And then a man by the name of Marty Seligman decided, we're going to spearhead this whole movement in American Psychological Association on positive psychology, because we're just studying how things go wrong and what happens and what the environment, what the genes are and what the choices are and how we can kind of fix bad things that go wrong. Well, what about people who grow up in a terrible environment, broken family, suffering horribly, and they're happy, they're joyful, they're successful? What about that? And how does that happen? How does this positive thing happen? How does that happen? And so this whole field of positive psychology is developed, and now there's a whole series of things you can read, books you can read on positive psychology. What's the resilience in people, and how does that happen? And they find that it's not just like the absence of negative things, the absence, non-pathology. It's not the negation of pathology. There's actually something going on that's powerful. And it's interesting because you read all their stuff and it's like, yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know that. You just read the Bible. It's all in there. So things like gratefulness, they have a feeling of gratefulness. They're thankful for the things that they do have, that they do see, and they're thanking things. They're being thankful to people. They experience and express forgiveness and letting things go. And there's a whole host of things that contribute to this positive psychology and this whole idea that because you had a bad parent, that's why you turned out bad. Well, what about the people who turn out really great? And actually, they turn out better because they have a depth. They have a maturity. You ever talk to a real old person who's been through a lot of stuff in life and just has a peace and a joy? And there's just something about them, and they've been through all kinds of things. And they can tell you because they're on the other side. There's something powerful about it. But how can we know it will all be worth it? How can we really know that it will all be worth it? Romans 8:28. All things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. So that provides incredible meaning, because I can trust, even though I don't see the end and I don't know it, I only see what's in front of me, but I can trust the one who set up the whole thing and planned it all from the beginning, and he's working it all out, and he's able to do that. So have you ever met anybody with joy, which makes no sense in the midst of suffering? Anybody ever met somebody like that? A couple of you have. Some of you haven't. Well, there's an example. Paul, Acts 16:25-30. Paul in the Philippian jail. Paul gets, because, again, he's just telling people good news, he gets flogged, which, like you saw in the Passion of Christ, those of you who have seen it, horrible thing, nasty, nasty thing. Incredible pain. He's flogged. And as if that isn't enough, the jailer puts him in the inner dungeon. in the Philippian jail, which is a horrible, just a dark, damp, rat-infested place. And he's probably bleeding from, his back's wide open from the flaying, and there he is in the stocks, and with his cohort Silas. Well, what would I do in that situation? Why? I was just trying to, oh my goodness, why is this? I was just trying to do something good, and all this happened to me, and God, why? And all this, you would think. But what does Paul do? He's singing. Paul and Silas are singing. They're singing hymns to God. Can you imagine that? There's something out of this world about that. And you know what? The other prisoners notice that, and they start to listen. But and there's a big miracle that happens. Now there's a miracle that happens that actually there's an earthquake, and the jail cell breaks apart, and their chains come off, and they're able to be free. And the guard gets ready to kill himself, because of course if he fails at his post, the Romans would kill him anyway. But he's ready to commit suicide, and Paul says, "Wait. They're all still here. We're all still here." You know what the biggest miracle, I think, is not the chains coming off and everything. When there was a prison in Haiti, and there was an earthquake there, and the prison broke apart, those prisoners, where do you think they were? Gone. These prisoners did not leave. That, I think, is the biggest miracle, because they saw something amazing in Paul and Silas that was out of this world. So also in Acts 5:41, I was telling you about the apostles, they're beaten and they're rejoicing. And the next thing they do, they go back to a prayer meeting, and the very next thing they do is they turn around and go back out to say the same good word. Either they're psychotic or they got something I want. And they weren't taking any drugs, by the way. So Jesus paid the ultimate price to solve the problem. He paid with his life and his suffering. And this is radically different from all other religions. No other religion is like this at all. Buddhism, suffering is caused by desire. You eliminate all desire. You just meditate and become more peaceful and eliminate all desire. And you watch a Buddhist monk that's at the highest level, and they're not really doing anything. People actually have to clip their toenails, feed them, and they're just sitting there, but they're at the highest level. And but they're closer to nirvana because they eliminate all wants and desires and striving. But is desire, is passion, is longing bad? What do you think? Desire is not bad. Well, of course, it's an easy question because I'm setting you up, right? But desire is not bad. Why do we long? Why do we long for paradise anyway? Doesn't that makes actually no sense in a messy fallen world? Why would we even spend time longing for something, better if there was no such thing in existence? I mean, it would be a waste of time. Paul actually said, if Christ is not risen from the dead, then we are of all men most miserable. We should just eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. There's no point in thinking about or longing for something better. That's ridiculous. It's stupid. And people who don't really believe the Bible will say those kinds of things too. But why do we long for paradise anyway? C.S. Lewis talked about a stomach makes no sense if there's no food. Why would a stomach exist if there's no such thing as food? The stomach is built for food. And just as the same way our hearts are built for what we are longing for, it points to the existence of something that is beyond us that we are really longing for. Remember the story of Sleeping Beauty? How does the story go? There's different versions of it. The woman gets pricked by she's going to spin on a spinning wheel, and the witch has a poisonous tip on the spinning wheel, pricks her finger, poisons her, she goes into a deathly trance. Or the witch, the Disney one, picks up the one, draws on the one where the witch gives her a poisonous apple, she bites into it, and she goes into a deathly sleep. But it's all that something tragically happened, and she goes into a death sleep. And actually the whole kingdom, most of the fairy tales, it goes into the whole kingdom is under a pall. And around the palace, the vines grow up and the thorns grow up, and it's terrible. And nobody knows what they can do about it. There's nothing that can be done about it. And from somewhere outside, nameless place, a prince comes. And the prince has to love Sleeping Beauty and kiss her to break the curse. Now, the interesting thing is fairy tales, by the way, and this is something I studied in psychology. Jungian psychology is a lot about this, and a guy named Stith Thompson. I won't go into this in a lot of depth, but fairy tales are very interesting because they're not like something, I'm going to write a fairy tale, write it down. Perry Sherman's fairy tale. They're things that nobody knows where they came from. They bubbled up in the wherever in the Black Forest, the Middle Ages, just different people talking and adding, and they just bubble up from somewhere in the society. And Jung thought, they really come from an unconscious, common unconscious phenomena in people's minds. They just bubble up, the different fairy tales, the real fairy tales, not just a little story like an Aesop's fable or something, but a really deep fairy tale that goes on and on for hundreds of years, and people recite them, and it just grabs your heart, grabs a child's heart. There's something in it. And Sleeping Beauty is one of these. That's why 500, 600 years later, it's still a big story. Why does every fairy tale begin with a disaster for the whole world and end with happily ever after? You ever think about that? I always thought, oh man, can't you describe the happily ever after? Like, give me some things about that. Show that happily ever after here. Come on, under the movie, right? No, it's always happily ever after. And it's always the yearning. And it's always starting, there's a bad thing, it's a terrible thing, the world's in a difficult state, and there's no solution. And somehow miraculously, some solution comes, and it's usually a prince from the outside that comes in, that loves. And so this is what J.R.R. Tolkien says. By the way, J.R.R. Tolkien was an expert. He wasn't just a writer of Lord of the Rings, you see the movies and stuff, but he was an expert, as well as C.S. Lewis, on deep myth and fairy tales. And one of the things he says about fairy tales, there's things that are really distinguishing in fairy tale, and one of them's called escape and consolation, and he uses these different terms. But there's always this kind of theme that the world is broken, and somehow it just seems real, but it's not parallel to our world, that it'll be messed up, like the chair did this and the bunny did, it's like somehow it gets us outside of ourselves into some other kind of reality, but it feels really, some sense, more real even than what he calls the primary world. Or he calls this the secondary world. That's more primary. But here's this quote from him. He says, "Far more powerful and poignant is the effect of joy in a serious tale of fairy. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of the story, and lets a gleam come through. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this perspective, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. And among its marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. A catastrophe is a bad thing that changes the whole world. It's all different. A eucatastrophe, eu is a Greek for good. It means a good, something so catastrophic, phenomenal, it changes the entire world for the good. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. So the longing is for something that is beyond us, that really is real. And this is a myth. I just put it up there because the Japanese have a myth about, it's called Tanabata, where the woman and the man are apart. They're in the stars. They represent some constellations, and there's a story, and they're in the stars, and they're apart for 364 days of the year. And one day out of the year, they're together. But the Japanese don't consider like, oh, it's just that one day. It's the 364 days of longing for my lover that are deep and profound and important. And as I quoted before, As a deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs for thee. One of the most famous Jungian psychologists, actually psychiatrists, his name was, James Hillman. 5 times he was president of the Jungian Society, which is like, to become a Jungian analyst, you not only have to be a psychiatrist, you have to go through Jungian psychotherapy, all your dreams analyzed like 3 or 4 times a week for 5 years. It's like not just being a doctor, it's being a, way high training. And he talked about the beauty of the empty basket. We're all saying, I want it now. But there's something profound in the longing. And the Japanese get it in their fairy tale, and actually in the longing in the fairy tales we get it too, because the happily ever after is not really described. So what's the secular explanation for evil? We've given the Christian one. And what's the secular solution? When people ask the question, how could there be a good God with evil in the world? Or how can he explain evil? And there is an explanation. You might like it or might not like it. But I like to ask, what's your explanation? It's hard. There isn't really a good one. Oh, did you have one? Yes. Right. So it's sort of the same explanation that we have a free will, and that's why there's evil in the world, and we have to have better opportunities to make good decisions, right? Except we don't use the God part, but where did free will come? How do we have free will? Prophecy. Yeah. Well, well, no, the source of free will and why there's free will. Right, 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 right. But it's positing that free will exists doesn't really explain it. It just says that there is free will. But that's good that you do agree that there is free will. Mm-hmm. I'm very glad of that. Yes. So you would agree, the secular explanation source of evil would be similar, as he's saying, would say that people do have free will, would agree that people actually have a choice and have the power to affect others in the world with their choice, and they have freedom. So he's saying it would be a similar kind of an explanation. He's saying that prophecy that the Christian or the biblical idea would be a problem because how can there be prophecy and there be free will? So the question of things being predicted, but people also having free will, would be a problem. And prayer also. How those are compatible with free will, yes. So the fact of being able to know the future, of being outside time and seeing all of time, because somehow you're in another dimension. You're not in a dimension. We live in 4 dimensions, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, not the next time, but the time after that. I'm going to talk about science in the Bible. And the idea of being in 4 dimensions, because we're in time dimension. We see things. This thing happens after this thing happens after this, and we see things in length, width, and height. But that question of free will and free choice is beyond our minds to really comprehend, because we're only in 4 dimensions. But if there are other dimensions, and other dimensions in time, width, length, and height, and you can see, and even saying see is not, it's like just an analogy, because we can't really understand more dimensions than the 4 that we live in. But if there's more than a more dimensional reality, then those are things that we wouldn't understand. But understanding that God knows all the things before they happen, but we in our time dimensional reality are still making free will choices. But our minds are blown apart by that, because all we have is experience of the 4 dimensions. So that's kind of the explanation for that. But I'm getting off of the problem of suffering and evil. So the explanation for suffering and evil, the secularists could say, is free will. By the way, a lot of secularists don't think there is free will. They don't think there's something beyond matter and energy. They think everything is really determined. Freud thought everything's determined. Skinner thought everything's determined. So really, free will is just an illusion. It's sort of an epiphenomenon that looks like it is, but it really isn't, because we're just a compilation of atoms. We don't really have actual choices to make. But if we're given actual choices, there's something beyond just the atoms making us do everything, and we have begin actual choice. That's where the source of evil and suffering comes from. But the real question, I think, is why did the only good person suffer such evil? The person who didn't deserve any of this and decided he was going to do this and suffered these things. Now, that's an interesting point, because were you here last time when 2 weeks ago, when I did the resurrection or Easter? Were you here for that? Oh, okay. Well, you might want to check that out, because the point I was making then is looking at history and looking at this historical documents and how you check historical documents for their reliability and accuracy and eyewitness testimony and all those kind of things. I did a whole thing on that. The evidence is really very, very good for the historicity of Jesus and what the Gospels say about him. And the New Testament documents are all eyewitness sources very clearly. If you throw them out, you have to throw out everything else in the classical world. Forget Rome, forget Greece, forget everything else in the ancient world. You have to say you know nothing about the ancient world, because if you throw these out, because these have way, way better evidence and more of it. So the point is, I demonstrated last time, those of you who were here, I went through very carefully all that. So Jesus, going by that evidence, these eyewitnesses observed him predicting what would happen to him and what he would do ahead of time. And yet Pilate, nevertheless, even though he said, I must go to Jerusalem, I must be betrayed, I must be betrayed to the religious leaders, I must suffer and die, and I must be crucified. And that's exactly what happened. But that didn't, so he knew what was going to happen. Historically, people saw this and have witnessed this, and yet Pilate made the decision and the Jews made the decision, and they actually carried it out, even though he knew ahead of time what would happen to him. I mean, that's just an example of it. The question of whether or not there can be foreknowledge and free will is actually a factual question. It's not an illogical question. It's a factual question. And then if I can't really explain it because I'm in 4 dimensions, I just can't explain it. There's a lot of things I can't explain. I can't explain how light can be a wave and a photon. I can't explain how an electron can be on this side of the atom and on that side of the atom and zero probability of being in between. But that's what the Schrodinger wave equation says. I can give you a whole bunch of things I can't explain, but what the facts say is what I'm going to go with. Anyway, but the real question then would be, why did the only good person suffer such evil? That's really the question. And the Bible says he did it because he wants relationship with us, and he wants to reconcile us to himself. And he can't just ignore the problems of the world, and he can't just ignore evil. We all want justice. He can't ignore that. But he also doesn't want to condemn us. And and this is the way that he solved the problem, by going and paying for it himself. Anyway, with that, I'm done, and we'll answer some questions and have some discussion. The next one is going to be, interestingly, we're going to do it on prophecies in the Bible, which have been fulfilled. Can we really validate this historically? How do we know when the prophetic books were written? We're going to go into evidence and archaeological evidence and the like, and we're going to look at what the Bible says about the future, which people seem to be interested in today. So I'm going to do that with Frank Ray. Thank you. You've been a great audience. Good questions. Any more questions? Yes. Thank you. The gentleman said, why? Thank you. I'll try to summarize that for the camera. I think the gentleman said, was it Rob or Billy? Said that he believes Jesus died because of to overcome sin, and to give you the power. Somehow by his death, he's giving you the power to overcome sin and make a decision for him, and he's giving you the power, in your sense, his power to be able to do that. The change is a process. Yeah. He says it's a process of overcoming sin, and he hasn't done it completely, but that's his goal. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Yes. Okay, I'm just going to repeat things. First, I said that my God was omnipotent. Right. The video gave a paradox. Can God make a square circle? And it's a logical contradiction. No, he can't. Right. So the question, like, can he make a rock so big that he can't move it? And the answer is no, because if he's omnipotent, by definition, he could make the infinite rock, but he could move it because he can't make a rock that's too big that he can't move, because it's by definition, if he's omnipotent, he can't do that. And you're saying, is he omnipotent? Is he all-powerful? Yes, but he can't do things that are illogical. Like, he can't make a creature with free will and deny the free will at the same time. He can't say, oh, Johnny, you can disobey me or you can obey me. Oh, but no, you can't disobey me. Every time you go to push that button, nope, I'm stopping you. Well, then you don't really have the freedom to choose, right? That's your question? Right. Right. So maybe we've just decided to do that. We don't make believe that it's actually a objective thing that there's really meaning, but we just decide I'm going to do this. Right. We assign a meaning. We just kind of capriciously assign a meaning because we want that to assign that meaning. In other words, there's not really an actual objective meaning. We just kind of assigned a meaning to something, right? We just assigned a meaning to it. So, um, okay, yeah, you would just assign a meaning to it, and you would live your life, and that's what the existentialist, uh, actually the atheist existentialist, because Kierkegaard was the father of existentialism. He actually was he was not an atheist; he was a Christian. But an atheist existentialist would say, "Well, I assign some meaning. I decide what I want to do with my life, and I do it with my life. Um, and then I die, and I say, okay, I did it." That's right. That's what you're saying, right? Right. Well, how? I'm a little confused because, I mean, I'm talking about meaning uh, as an objective thing, not just something I made up. Because I can make up, you know, like I gave in my talk before, I can make up a toasted cheese deity. I can believe there's a toasted cheese deity, uh, and there's no way of validating it or not. And I just like to believe this. I want to believe this. I saw people in the hospital who thought, because I worked in the psych ward, who would believe certain things, and they wanted to believe them, but of course we can make up things and decide them, and we can act on them. But saying that there is actually objective meaning, there really is a meaning to things, is a different matter. Yeah. How do you define better? But do you see the problem? Do you see the problem with that? Because people define good and bad differently. Different societies and different times in the history of the world have defined things differently. What's good and what's bad, and that's right. That would throw objective morality out the window because we're just defining. Well, I think this is good and I think that's bad. That was a big problem in the international human rights community, because the nations that were about the state and the good of the collective could violate the rights of individuals, because really it's better overall for the state. It's better that we squelch out the opposition, and we suppress these people, because the good of the state is really the best good. And then the other people would debate, no, the individual is important, and you can't just crush the individual by the state because you want what's better for the collective society. Hey, you got too much money, I'm going to take your money, and it's better for more people, but now I'm violating your freedom to generate money and do what you want. So there's not a uniform understanding of what's good. And what happens is that people get their values, and in this society, a lot of people have their values. They're kind of living on inherited capital, because we grow up in a society that is influenced through past generations. Really, it's influenced by Judeo-Christian values, and so we think, killing something is wrong. But killing someone else is wrong. We think certain things are not right. We have this inherent sense of things. But if you grew up in a headhunting culture, that's why I showed the slide. You grew up in a headhunting culture, and it was normal. It's like you gain the power of your enemy by cooking them and eating them, and the rule there is clean your plate. it's a different objective for morality. And whose decides whose is right and whose is wrong? If you don't have anything outside of the human condition, you don't have any place to go for that. Do you understand what I was saying about Eichmann and Nuremberg? Who gets to decide what international law should be? Which group of people in which country? Is it the majority? If you have the majority, what if the majority, like in many times in history, believes that slavery is fine? What if well, that's okay, but you know what? We always think that we're better than everybody else. That's our tendency. We think we're better than people in the past, and we know what we're doing, and we're doing what's right and what's good. But it's not uniform. What I'm saying, people 100 years from now may look back and say, "Wow, what the heck were they doing?" And people 100 years before will look and say something differently. Sure. Not everybody who founded the country believed in the Bible, and Thomas Jefferson said some things, said lighthouses are more important than churches, and the like. Sure, that can be true, but Thomas Jefferson as well was still influenced by the values. He grew up coming out of a culture, and our law is influenced by English common law, which was strongly influenced over centuries. If you read William Blackstone, was strongly influenced by the Old Testament and also by the New Testament. So that's the reason why we don't have kangaroo courts and we don't have the like. We have two or more witnesses. We have all kinds of things in our law. It is actually influenced by it. It doesn't mean every founding father believed the Bible or believed Christianity, but that doesn't mean they're not influenced by it. The value systems that we often get from our ancestors and our surroundings. You have a different value because you grow up here than if you grew up in Saudi Arabia. You have a different value for women. You have a different value for many things. Anyway, thank you very much. That's a great discussion. I appreciate it. Thank you for your questions. I'll be around. You can come up and talk to me, but thank you very much. We will see you on June 5th. It will definitely be interesting and lively.